Ever heard of Russell Walker? He proclaimed God is a white supremacist and that all Jews descend from Satan. Who is Russell Walker? Well, he's the Republican candidate for a seat in the North Carolina state legislature. Steve West hosts a YouTube channel where he said, "Looking back at history, unfortunately, Hitler was right." West speaks of Jewish cabals that are harvesting baby parts from Planned Parenthood. He recently won the Republican primary for a seat in the Missouri House of Representatives. John Fitzgerald posted a reward online for $2,000 to anybody who can prove that the official Holocaust narrative is true. He will be a Republican candidate for the California House of Representatives. Ilhan Omar is already a Democratic state representative in Minnesota and nearly certain to win a U.S. congressional seat this year. She tweeted, quote, "Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel," end quote, which she described as an apartheid regime. These are real candidates who aspire to run our country. ADL reports that there are more people running for public office who express anti-Semitic views than ever before. And beyond politics, a recent ADL study reported a near 60% increase in harassment, vandalism, and assault of Jews and Jewish institutions in 2017, the largest single increase on record. Now, I try not to be an alarmist, even though we Jews are conditioned to be. You've heard the classic Jewish telegram. It reads, "Start worrying, details to follow." But as I've witnessed, the recent increase in anti-Semitism, the ugliness unearthed during the last presidential election, the desecration of Jewish cemeteries, the Unite the Right March in Charlottesville, the increasing vilification of pro-Israel students on college campuses, I'll admit that I am quite alarmed and felt that I had to speak about it tonight. Anti-Semitism never exists in a vacuum. The tolerance for anti-Semitism goes hand in hand with a tolerance for hatred of all kinds. And if we Jews are not going to pay attention to its dangers, who will? Our tradition calls Rosh Hashanah Yom Teruah, the day for the sounding of the shofar. And the Hebrew word teruah comes from the verb hitriah, which means to warn. A traditional role of the shofar in ancient Israel was to warn our people of danger. Our shofar call this year must do the same. If you've been listening, you've already heard the warning blasts coming from Jewish communities in Europe. Western Europe has seen a terrifying outbreak of violent anti-Semitism. In France alone, 12 people have been murdered just because they are Jews. In England, the Labour Party has acknowledged it has an anti-Semitism problem. But its leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has only amplified anti-Semitic comments and Holocaust denial. Corbyn's recent attempt to legislate that it was not anti-Semitic to liken Israel or its policies to Nazi Germany or to call Zionism racism, it scared the British Jewish community enough that ultra-Orthodox rabbis were willing to sign the same petitions as female rabbis. Just last week, that's bad. Yeah. Just last week in Germany, an angry mob led by hundreds of neo-Nazis were joined by over 8,000 ordinary citizens, which signifies a frightening normalization of their anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic rhetoric. Last spring, a group of rabbis spoke with Simone Radin Ben Zaken, the director of AJC Europe. about the shifting landscape for European Jews, and I asked if she had any words of advice for us. She said, "Yes, I wish we had spoken louder here in France. We felt we were too powerful and well-connected for this to be a real threat. We all wasted a lot of time." Her message to American Jewish leaders was clear. Don't wait. Rally your community. Speak up before it's too late. And if you think it's only happening in France and England, in North Carolina or Missouri, think again. It's happening right here in New York. Last spring, as unrest mounted in Gaza, the head of the history department at a prestigious private school in New York posted the headline, "Israelis kill dozens in Gaza," on the wall outside his classroom, with a terrifying photo and no context. This teacher's politics were well known. He made it explicit in an article he wrote for Mondo Weiss entitled, "Against Balance: Thoughts on Teaching Israel-Palestine." Some of his students, however, decided that balance was a good idea when it came to this complicated issue. They started posting other articles on the wall to provide additional background and support for Israel's right to defend its border. A second history teacher then joined in the debate and posted an article that likened Israel's actions to war crimes. This same teacher screamed at a student who was wearing an IDF t-shirt, saying that Israelis were terrorists. Later, during a heated discussion about Israel, he lost control and violently kicked chairs and slammed a desk. This is not a matter of microaggressions. This is aggression, directed at pro-Israel students by authority figures in a school. The school finally called a town hall meeting, and over 200 concerned parents came for a thoughtful and candid conversation. But when the press got a hold of this story, it was reframed as an attempt by self-interested Jews to stifle free speech. The most egregious example was a recent article in the Huffington Post, which dismissed entirely the merits of the debate and instead headlined a story about angry Zionists and a conspiracy of influential parents who exploited their wealth and their powerful media connections as they plotted to remove teachers who dare oppose Israel. It seemed this writer was trying to set a record for the most anti-Semitic dog whistles he could fit into one article. Around the same time, this past spring, at another well-regarded all-boys school here in New York, one of our Central fifth graders was told by a classmate in front of his entire lunch table, "God sent Hitler down to kill the Jews because they nailed Jesus to the cross." His mother, Jill Kargman, courageously wrote about this episode for Tablet magazine. Jill, never afraid of being the odd mom out, sorry, I couldn't resist, she delivered a stack of books on the Holocaust to the offending student's apartment with a note saying, "We thought this would prove valuable reading for your family. Best, the Kargmans." But when Jill emailed the headmaster about the incident, the response was little more than a shrug. The offending student was told he would have to miss 2 field trips. And this was at the same school where a child was expelled for using the N-word. The school was sending a clear message. In the hierarchy of prejudice, anti-Semitism barely registers. When Jill told me the story, I offered to call the headmaster, but she said, "No, I feel like I've caused enough trouble already. I don't feel comfortable being one of those Jews." In the end, she decided to pull her child from the school. We can't win. If we don't complain, nothing happens. And if we make a fuss, we're accused of abusing our disproportionate power and influence, which is exactly how Jews have been slandered for centuries. Unfortunately, I fear we've begun to internalize some of this prejudice, and it can make us hesitant to stand up for ourselves. These stories from our own students in our finest schools in America's most Jewish city certainly got my attention. And one of the scariest things about today's rise in anti-Semitism is that it's coming at us from both sides. From the right, white supremacists don't just consider Jews an enemy alongside immigrants and other people of color, but the ultimate enemy. I learned this from an unlikely source. Eric Ward, a Black activist from the Southern Poverty Law Center, who once attended a white supremacist convention and was able to build alliances by posing as a Jew hater. Ward shared before a group of rabbis that anti-Semitism is the fuel that moves the engine of white nationalism. Their ideology traffics in the fantasy that Jews possess an invisible, outsized, even supernatural power. In a terribly disturbing Atlantic magazine profile of the alt-right Nazi Andrew Anglin, writer Luke O'Brien sums up how white nationalists, quote, blame everything they hate on a cabal of Jews. Feminism, immigration, the media, science, facts, video game addiction, romantic failure, the NBA being 74.4% Black. It's all a plot to undermine the traditional white patriarchy so Jews can maintain a parasitic dominion over the earth. Wow. I have a very high opinion of the Jewish community, but even I didn't know we were that powerful. And this crazy talk has increasingly become normalized in today's society. Derek Black, a former leader of the white nationalist movement, said that for most of his life, white nationalists knew to keep their views to themselves. But after Charlottesville, when the President of the United States said, "You had some very fine people on both sides," Black knew the tide had turned. He described Trump's words as, quote, the most important moment in the history of the modern white nationalist movement. But white supremacists and neo-Nazis are not the only ones we have to fear. Today, anti-Semitism is increasingly found on the left as well. It emerged this year that Tamika Mallory, the co-chair of the Women's March, had attended a rally of the Nation of Islam led by the famously anti-Semitic Louis Farrakhan. She praised this man, who claims Jews were behind the 9/11 attacks and who called Hitler a very great man. She later doubled down with this bewildering tweet: if your leader does not have the same enemies as Jesus, they may not be the leader. The co-chair of arguably the most important progressive movement of the last 2 years could not bring herself to denounce the hate-filled Farrakhan, and she defended him by employing the oldest canard that Jews killed Jesus. Now, I want to speak directly to our high school and college students because the anti-Semitism of the left is especially pronounced on liberal campuses. In these progressive communities, otherwise devoted to identifying victims of oppression and prejudice, Jewish complaints about anti-Semitism are often dismissed, even derided. My friend, Professor Deborah Lipstadt from Emory University, shared with me the galleys of her upcoming book on anti-Semitism, which should be required reading for all of you. She sums up a disturbing sentiment she often hears from students on campuses. Jews are always playing the Holocaust card. Suffering? They're just trying to hitch a free ride on the backs of people of color who face real racism. They are white, and they are privileged. First of all, in case this wasn't obvious, not all Jews are white. Second of all, I want to acknowledge that despite the stories I shared, that right now in America is probably the best time in our history to be a Jew. We should recognize that sitting in this room, our Jewish community holds extraordinary power. Every bigotry takes different forms, and ours is not the same as racism against blacks in our country. But we need not order them on the podium of the Oppression Olympics to take all hatred seriously. Furthermore, the long-standing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is indeed confounding and upsetting, fuels anti-Semitism on the left, which often hides behind a false veneer of legitimate criticism of Israel. Last spring, a Central student enrolled at NYU came to me distressed. 50 different progressive student organizations on campus, from the Black Student Union to LGBTQ groups, pledged a boycott. Not only a boycott of Israeli goods and Israeli academic institutions, but a refusal to partner with the most mainstream Jewish organizations on campus, including the ADL, Birthright, and AIPAC, on any topic whatsoever. Issues such as gay rights, feminism, and racism, which Jews have long championed. Opposition to Israel has increasingly become a necessary precondition for all other progressive commitments. Some groups will only allow Jewish students to participate if they take a disloyalty oath and affirm they are opposed to Israeli racism. The singling out of Israel as the litmus test for Jewish involvement in any social justice cause is anti-Semitism, plain and simple. And I beg of you students to call it out when you see it. To be sure, not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. It should come as no surprise to hear me say that, because I have publicly wrestled with a lot of things about Israel in recent years. But even if you're not a rabbi, it is perfectly fair for you to criticize Israel the way you would criticize any country, including our own. The problem is when people criticize Israel in a way they would criticize no other country. So where is the line? To help, I want to share a 3D test conceived by Natan Sharansky and adopted as part of the US State Department's own definition of anti-Semitism to help you recognize when Israel criticism is really just dressed up anti-Semitism. The 3Ds are delegitimization, double standards, and demonization. When people deny only the Jewish people's right to self-determination, when they characterize a return to our homeland of 3,000 years as a racist, white colonialist endeavor and call into question Israel's very right to exist, this delegitimization is anti-Semitism. When the UN Human Rights Council calls out Israel for fully half of its condemnations, human rights condemnations, more than the resolutions against the horrific regimes of Syria and Iran and North Korea combined, this double standard is anti-Semitism. When the Israeli Defense Forces are characterized as terrorists or Nazis, wantonly killing Palestinians in a genocide, this demonization is anti-Semitism. At this point, I'm guessing that my Teruah warning call has left many of you looking over both of your shoulders with distress. But I'm also guessing that you've already determined that one side is much worse than the other. Be honest. Were you more outraged that Tamika Mallory refused to denounce Farrakhan, or were you more outraged by Trump's inability to flatly denounce the white supremacists after Charlottesville? Are you making excuses for one of them? In order to be principled in this fight, we must be willing to call out the anti-Semitism on our own side of the aisle. It's easy to convince ourselves that the one on our side exists only at the powerless fringe, or that it's outweighed by more important ideological alliances. But we have to be as intolerant of anti-Semitism from our political allies as from our foes. Journalist Yair Rosenberg recently said to me, "Fight anti-Semitism where you are, not just when it's politically expedient. It's more credible and more effective." To fight anti-Semitism, we must also resist our understandable desire to leave when we feel we're not wanted. It's not easy to sit at a table or engage when we feel under attack. But we must stay in it. Stay in the conversation about Israel. Stay in the fight for pluralistic causes, because Jews have always been on the forefront against oppression of all kinds. And when others don't invite us to the table, perhaps we have to be willing to invite them to ours. I mentioned earlier the former white nationalist leader Derek Black. He was David Duke's godson, and his father was the founder of Stormfront, the largest white nationalist website in the country. Following in his father's footsteps, Derek started his own white supremacist radio show. And he was a rising star, the heir apparent of the white nationalist movement. But when he went to a small liberal arts college in Florida, he saw that his views were unaccepted, and he tried to go undercover. When his identity was discovered online, he was completely ostracized at the school. No one would speak to him, except for one Orthodox Jew, who invited him to his Shabbat table every week. And little by little, Black changed his mind. Not only renouncing his anti-Semitic views, but also his racism and hatred for homosexuals. When he first wrote about his transformation online, his father had thought that his email had been hacked. But when he realized it was genuine, his father renounced him publicly, as did David Duke. I generally don't celebrate when a son loses a father, but in this case, it was a measure of his redemption. Our Jewish tradition teaches that every person has the capacity to change, and we are charged to act on that belief. But it might require us to move into some new and perhaps hostile territory. Our final shofar call of the holiday, Tekiah, literally means to move place. And in biblical times, a Tekiah blast called our army to reposition during wartime. In our fight against anti-Semitism, we must be willing to mobilize for the battle. That means you identify anti-Semitism in its many forms and not internalize any of its hateful prejudice. It means that you call anti-Semitism out, not only on the other side of the political spectrum, but with allies, sometimes with teachers, even friends. It means that you defend the right for Jewish self-determination and don't apologize for the existence of the state of Israel. It means you take some risks to get to know someone you might detest in order to change his hate. It means you stay at the table with self-respect, never forgetting who you are, a Jew. Jews have been fighting anti-Semitism for centuries. Each generation must learn to fight what is the oldest and most adaptive hatred in history. It has been tragically devastating at times. Only 75 years ago, 1 out of every 3 Jews on the planet was murdered from anti-Semitic hatred. But we are still here. And maybe more miraculous is that we Jews have not only survived, but thrived and succeeded and contributed to the world in beautiful and in extraordinary ways. We should feel great pride. So let us stand up for ourselves. Let us stand against hatred of all kinds. Let us stand for the human capacity to change. This is who we are. On this Yom Teruah, this day for the sounding of the shofar, we conclude with a powerful tekiyah. This is our call to move. This year, let us heed that call.